This year, you'll believe that a man can have a flight stand with their McFarlane. We are so back, boys. Coinciding with the hype or discourse, depending on who you ask on the internet, of the new James Gunn Superman trailer, McFarlane has finally made good with probably the worst kept secret that I think that they have ever tried to mask under leak after leak after leak. This guy would always show up on those documents to the point where I thought to myself, all right, wherever there's smoke, there's fire. And finally entering, well, kind of sort of ending the year of 2024, but also then kind of entering the new year of 2025. So it really depends on which retailer you pull this from. It finally seems like, in terms of widespread release, we got a proper DC Multiverse 7-inch Christopher Reeve McFarlane Toys Superman. It's one that I did think it was a little bit on the overdue side, but frankly, one that I think struck the iron while it was hot at the most opportune moment. Whether it be with the, like I said, all the talk about Superman going into this year with a brand new reboot of a film, but also a brand new arc in the comics with Absolute Superman. Much more talk about it within the DCU, and has kind of revitalized so many people kind of now putting their eyes on Superman more so than even Batman, and I'm actually kind of down for it, because keep in mind that it really was that first 1978 Superman with Christopher Reeve that really set in the tentpole superhero blockbuster. I mean, we had the actual quintessential blockbuster just 3 years before with Jaws. We had Star Wars just a couple years later, and then only 1 year later, whilst John Williams was really at his, like, just going crazy. He was lighting orchestras up in literal fire. He brought us the Superman theme with the 1978 Richard Donner film, and it's because of that movie that we practically have superhero movies these days. It really was. It's snowballed into craziness. And we all owe it to this man right here. The man, the myth, the legend, the Man of Steel himself, Christopher Reeve, donning the suit. And I can't think of any other alternate reality where this doesn't get a collector's edition embodiment from McFarlane. Now that they've ushered in this brand new line within the past year or two, practically since 2023, they started the collector's edition line, going up to the MSRP of $30. But this was definitely a guy that I thought to myself, yes, gladly I will spend the $30, because with a character, or at least a portrayal as iconic and as legendary as this, it deserves the collector's edition. I will gladly pay the extra tax. And pulling it out of the box and just seeing it here in person after the multitude of promo images and such, I thought to myself, yes, this is in fact, quite honestly, something that was much overdue, even if it comes at the behest of a few issues here and there. Issues that I'm finally sort of subscribing myself to when it comes to McFarlane. It's some that people kept swearing were happening with every single DC Multiverse release, and I thought to myself, it's not happening with every release, but it is kind of becoming a little bit more visually apparent with this specific version of the Christopher Reeve Superman. One that I thought to myself we were kind of gladly putting behind us, but it's still becoming a little prevalent here in modern times, at least in the year of our Lord 2025, to the point where I do think that something is eventually going to have to budge with McFarlane to keep this from becoming a regular thing. But before I get to that, I frankly feel like they went with a buck, they went with a physicality as far as this 7-inch figure that really does match the overall physique and build of Christopher Reeve. I would have liked it if maybe he was a little bit broad on the shoulders, because he really did have a classic 1970s bodybuilder physique, especially after the pounds that he packed on to take on the role. Because initially, he was a pretty tall guy, and he was a pretty fit guy, but since then, they've unearthed an awful lot of like behind the scenes reels showing him kind of working out at the gym, and he did pack on a little bit more muscle than he had on average. So to see that he was kind of building up to that 6'4", 225 that he was telling Lois Lane he was, it for the most part translates fairly well here in DC Multiverse fashion, except maybe a little bit around the torso and, like I said, a little bit of shoulder area. The only reason why it kind of becomes a little bit invisible from a very quick glance are the washer pieces that connect the shoulder on over to the torso. If it wasn't for those washer pieces, I would argue that maybe the shoulders are just a little bit more on the much narrower side from the horizontal plane. But apart from that, I would argue that getting the suit almost to the T as far as specific color hues, going for the very, very on brand, really saturated and very bright blue for the specific hue they utilized here, as well as the red. Saw some people bringing up that they didn't really like how big the boots were on the new James Gunn Superman suit, but we kind of forget that he did have some pretty in-your-face boots for the original 78 version of the costume, and it looks like they also kind of carried on over here in DC Multiverse format, so it's good to see that they still kind of replicated that look to the point where it kind of, put me off a little bit initially, but then I think back to the scenes from the original movie and I'm like, yeah, he had some pretty apparent, very thick, really glossy looking boots, so they translated fairly well. The only thing that I think is pretty evident didn't really translate, and I think does feel a little bit on the cheaper side, would have to be the trunks. I do think that they're a little bit on the wobbly side, especially when you kind of notice how the belt is starting to warp a little bit towards the top. It's kind of going a little up and down in a very wavy format. And this isn't the only issue that I have with the diaper piece, but I can only kind of convey that a little further when we get to articulation. The only other nitpick I have to kind of comment on right here as far as presentation would have to be that Superman symbol. Even though I do like the glossy nature to it because it did look like a very screen printed graft on the costume itself. Even if you go back and watch the movie, you can kind of see that it's like a printing that's on there. And it doesn't look too bad in film, but I did notice that that's pretty much the approach I had when tailoring the costume. And so here you have an actual embossed piece, so it's not just an easy paint stamp. They actually sculpted it onto the chest, so that's pretty cool, and it kind of gives it a little bit of added depth and presence to it. The only nitpick, and I can't emphasize enough that this is in fact just a nitpick, it's almost like 95% accurate, except you'll notice the little loop here at the bottom where you have the end of the S. It's usually more rounded on the original Christopher Reeve Superman, and here they went for a slightly angled look. It almost kind of reminds me of the Brandon Routh Superman logo, and here it looks like they kind of angled it in a way that it reminds me of the latter 2006 look to the Superman symbol as opposed to the original Christopher Reeve one. So if I had it my way, I don't know if maybe that's just mine, maybe some others have their version that has a little bit more of a spherical look to that end part of the S. Again, it's just me nitpicking. I know it's not a formal complaint. If anything, we start to go into some really awesome things about it, which would have to be a couple of things that would only work in the much more contemporary DC multiverse that McFarlane has been able to crank up. Among them would have to be, of course, the fabric felt cape with the wires at the end here to be able to pose the cape in a variety of ways. I appreciate that it's trimmed the right way. This is in fact how long it was. I know that we're kind of used, at least in modern times, to a much longer cape for your traditional Superman, especially ever since we had the Cavill Superman, or even the new David Cornsweat's suit. It looks like he's going to have a slightly longer cape that's sort of trailing off the ground. But Christopher Reeve Superman, he thought of himself, that's not efficient. I could trip over myself. So he always had a little bit of a shorter cape that kind of stopped at the boots, and it's cool that they were a little bit more accurate to that look here in the McFarlane toys. I do appreciate that, again, the specific hue of red they utilized, the stamped on yellow symbol on the back, very accurate and very nostalgic, and the actual fabric felt of the cape. I thought to myself, if they go with nylon again, I might just frankly lose it, because this is a guy that deserves the cloth cape, the fabric cloth, and that one that it's actually double stitched in quality. And thankfully, they did not spare any expense. They treated this guy right. He's got some really formidable wires here at the end that feel really good to kind of bend and pose and maneuver in a way that looks like it's flapping in the wind, just like we've seen him do a number of times when he's taking flight in the film. But apart from that, I don't know if this is just me, but my favorite thing to kind of pose with the cape is to have it accurately wrap around the shoulders to make it look, like I said, a bit more classic, nostalgic, and kind of tie in and get tucked away very appropriately and not cheaply around the neck area, which is one of the other concerns that I was having with this figure, because more often than not, even with cloth cape or fabric cape Superman figures, like most recently that new Action Comics reissue that became a Walmart exclusive gold label, it really felt very cheap of how they kind of tucked away and stitched the cape at the top where the neck and the body meet. And thankfully here, they were a little bit much more, I guess, much nicer to the way that they treated the tucking in, that it feels a bit more quality and refined. And speaking of this area here, we of course talk about the head sculpt, which nailed the accurate look to the color tone. I was scared that they were going to make him a little too pasty, but Christopher Reeve had always a bit of an olive skin complexion. Like naturally, he just had that natural kind of darkerish kind of skin tone to him. I don't know what it is, but he always had that, and it's cool that they were accurate with the skin tone that they applied to this guy right here. The only time, frankly, now looking back at the movie, the only time that he had a much pastier complexion was when he was Clark Kent. So I don't know if he went through the extra step of adding makeup. Imagine a deleted scene like that. I'm genuinely surprised they didn't include that in the movie. But apart from that, you can see that they got the hair right, even with the little curl there at the front, the actual ridges, and the tone to the hair to make it seem like it's individually combed, to give it those little lines in between. Granted, it also makes it a little cumbersome to keep it clean, because ever so often I do notice like some pieces of dust and stuff kind of falls in there, so do be careful with that. As far as the likeness, this has always been a topic of discussion when it comes to the McFarlane Toys community, and frankly, from my perspective, I do see Christopher Reeve for the most part. It's not a one-to-one. I still have seen some other manufacturers within this scale, whether it be somewhere between 6-inch or maybe 7-inch, 8-inch-ish or so, like Mezco, and maybe some third party. I have yet to see if maybe even Mayfix or Figuarts would have ever tackled this specific scale, or at least somewhere within the prosumer tier. And trust me, I'll try to keep my ear to the ground as best as possible should they ever tease one, because frankly I feel like that's money to be printed, especially if they're able to nail down that likeness. As far as McFarlane's is concerned, within the affordable market of $30, I would say this is mostly a serviceable likeness as far as the head sculpt is concerned, specifically around the chin and cheekbone area. It's once we get to like the nose and the eyes that do feel just a little bit too wide, a little too separated, to where it looks like a caricature of Christopher Reeve, less or so than Christopher Reeve himself, at least as far as this neutral head sculpt is concerned, because that's where we face one of the greatest little plot twists, especially when having this figure in hand later on when we tackle the accessories. As far as the default head sculpt that you get here right out of the box, it does the job. But again, the likeness could have been done a little bit better. It's respectful, but I feel like they could have pushed it a little bit of an extra tier to give us something really accurate. But then again, this is McFarlane Toys that we're talking about. They've never been known to have like the most accurate good likenesses. I mean, ever so often they hit it out of the park as far as like as the Morgan Freeman, Lucius Fox. But for every figure that looked pretty accurate as far as like likeness, they frankly pump out like 2 or 3 that look, like I said, caricatures. They look a little exaggerated. They look just a little askew as far as actually nailing down the proportions and the qualities that make that actor. And frankly, I would say that the Christopher Reeve one here is in fact one of those versions. But at least, like I said, for the most part, they managed to add something onto it that at least gives it a little bit of respect, a little bit of, like I said, uniformity and fitting in with the rest of the body sculpt. Even if it's still including something that I really don't like about some of these head sculpts, specifically some of the ones that you're able to switch out, which is that they sculpt out an extra piece to connect the jaw to the hair right underneath the ear. I'm sorry, but I hate that. Please, McFarlane, stop. This is not the first time I've seen this, and frankly, I feel like it's a running trend with figures that have swappable heads, and I just kind of wish that they would stop, because it just kind of takes me out, especially with it being unpainted. Just stop it. Thankfully, those added little unpainted pieces don't do anything to the head articulation itself. It's able to rotate the full 360 in place no problem, and can kind of tilt up a little bit. I kind of wish it would go a little farther, especially when you're dealing with a character that's all about looking up and looking pretty hopeful and triumphant, so it's kind of a little bit of a bummer that is the case. Can kind of look down slightly as well, so the neck stump itself maybe could have used a little bit of extra refinement when it comes to tilting. Good on the rotation for obvious reasons, but tilting either from up and down or even side to side. Actually, side to side is a bit more complimentary, so I would have liked that if maybe he could look up a little further, especially when you take context into consideration or posability, or certain poses and dynamic stances that you would want to put him in. Especially, again, some that are befitting the character. At least as far as the top shoulders though, because of these giant washer pieces and the dumbbell design inside, the arms are fully able to rotate 360 no problem, can even kind of shrug and flip and kind of move backwards and forwards butterfly style pretty effectively. And extension towards the sides is also no problem. You could even give it a little bit of an extra push to kind of move the washer pieces out of the side, and you'll notice that he does a very even T-pose, so that is pretty cool. And then underneath it, you got the bicep swivels that can fully rotate 360 no problem, even if the biceps are a little bit on the oversized, because I don't remember Christopher Reeve having that much muscle mass. I mean, it's good to see that they kind of, compensated him on there, but that kind of just befits my earlier concern that I was having, which is that the shoulders might be a little bit on the narrow side, and that's because maybe being right next to this massive bicep, they look like that by comparison. And speaking of weirdness kind of coming through here in figure form, you have the two elbow joints that can fully bend almost all the way up and kind of collapse the arm into itself, so good for posability, good for flexibility, but they sculpted the joints for the elbows just a little bit too on the narrow side, that when you kind of take a quick look at them from the front like this, like, is it just me or does that just look really weird? Like Superman just turns into a goddamn Gundam at this point. It's just gonna start, or like Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. But that's comedic. What's really a bit of a bummer though would have to be these wrist joints, because even though they're effective as far as allowing the hand to rotate 360 and then bending inwards and outwards pretty effectively, no problem, and are even a little bit on the ratcheted side, I do think that they're a bit, I guess you could say overproduced, because they do feel like they're a little longer. This is probably one of the few times where maybe a traditional ball joint as opposed to the flush cylindrical joint that I've often complimented would have benefited it because of how much thinner his suit was, since this is meant to be a bit more skin tight, unlike the gauntlets for a Batman figure. Because of this design, it makes not only the wrist feel kind of elongated, but then by effectively the hands much bigger than they already are. Because yes, I am completely aware that for some reason McFarlane keeps making Superman figures with really massive hands, like giant hands. This is the first time this has happened. I happen to own one of the figures that, despite really digging the figure, even I can recognize that the hands are just massive on that guy, and that's got to be the Shazam comic page puncher Superman that comes with like the muted tone and the chiseled head sculpt. That guy's got some massive hands, and it looks like they kind of came across the same issue here with Christopher Reeve's Superman. I don't know what it is, but the hands that I have here for the posterity of the review that technically didn't come with by default, but I just kind of wanted to give him these hands for the sake of the review. It makes it look, like I said, a bit on the longer side and much bigger than they would be in a natural kind of proportional state. And then when I got to the torso, it's where I realized that maybe despite being pretty complimentary to his physique, this buck doesn't necessarily do as much for the articulation as I would have hoped, because there's really not much in the way of rotation on the mid-torso. I mean, there is a mid-torso cut there, and it kind of nudges from side to side, but it's pretty stuck on mine. It feels almost kind of scary to give it any kind of turn in any direction because of the way that it's sculpted, as far as having that much more, flattened look to his physique. So again, it complements the look of his character, the way that he looked like on screen, but at the same time, it kind of conflicts this piece versus this piece to get any kind of decent rotation all the way around. Especially when it comes to crunching. There's virtually no crunching on the mid-torso, but there is a bit more of extension. You can see right there, extension towards the back. It flexes a bit more fluidly, and then you get a little bit of added flexibility via the waist joint right here. So it kind of nudges towards the back a little bit more, and then when it comes to crunching, the waist can kind of crunch a little bit right there because of the flexibility of the diaper, and then much more flexible on the waist, or as far as the obliques are concerned. You can see right there that it does kind of flex a little bit more right there in that direction. But same thing as the mid-torso, turning on the waist, I can kind of feel it a little bit more. Actually, you can do the full, it feels like you could do the full 360. So yeah, just mind the diaper piece, because like I said, you could kind of cause a little bit of wear and tear should that happen. But as far as the mid-torso, it feels a little bit more stuck than I would have wanted. And then speaking of that diaper piece, this is where I was mentioning before of how I have a little bit of a conflicted relationship with it, because the top leg joints can definitely flex pretty fluidly and pretty far towards the top like so. and then extend towards the back like so, even though it creates a little bit of a gap. But just mind giving it back to the place that it was before, because when you do it, at least when I did it with the right leg, say for example I were to flex it this way, and now because I'm recording the review, it's not happening. But a couple of times where I was kind of putting it in a variety of poses or extending the legs, which he does an even split. That is actually pretty remarkable. But just mind that ever so often when trying to put this guy back into position, this gap that it generates, it does catch the diaper piece a couple of times. So it almost did it right there. But a couple of times it did bend the diaper piece and cause a little bit of wear and flexing and warping of the edge rim right here of the diaper piece and getting caught between the gaps to the point where it could potentially damage that diaper piece. So just be careful with trunks themselves. But the rest of the articulation is pretty standard issue. You got two joints at the knees that can fully bend all the way up and are slightly ratcheted for your convenience. You got that flexible ankle joint that I really like, that is cylindrically based as opposed to the ball joint, that can flex the boot or the foot downwards and upwards, ratchet it and pretty firmly and pretty comfortable, can rotate the full 360 in place. Now, frankly though, I would have liked it for some extra bend on the toes, because unfortunately, I don't know what it is, but this time they went with some slightly short-handed or short-toed toe articulation, short-footed. There you go. That's what I was looking for. Short-footed toe articulation, because it can only really bend about that far up. So it's not the most even cut, as you can kind of see it right there, but it does the job. And again, the ankle articulation is pretty hefty enough to at least provide some extra footing and balance. And I mean, let's face it, out of all the articulation, that's probably going to be the least of your problems. Like I said, the torso, I wish it could have flexed in different directions a little bit more apart from the extension towards the back, which I guess would be the direction that you would want it to if you want to be posing him in a variety of flying poses, especially since thankfully, inside of the box, as mentioned at the beginning, he does finally come with a flight stand. McFarlane, thank you, because lately they've been doing this really strange thing where characters that typically fly have only been coming with the black bases and no flight stands, so that was really bewildering. But out of all the recent releases, it's good to see that Christopher Reeve's Superman comes with a flight stand, apart from the collector's edition card, and then a variety of different hand accessories, which makes it at least a little bit of an easier pill to swallow as far as those massive hands are concerned, because at least bigger hands means that it's a little easier to swap them in and out. It makes it a little bit more easier to grab, easier to kind of maneuver and manage and be able to prop them on the pegs themselves and swap them out, which I technically already did, because as you can see right here, he comes with a pair of relaxed semi-open hands. However, these are not the hands that he came with by default. By default, he comes with fisted hands, which traditionally favor his flying position, as far as the typical way that he flew in the movie would often be with fists. Very seldom would he extend his hands or open his hands mid-flight. It looks like it was kind of like a balancing thing. I don't know if maybe it helped Chris Reeve focus a little better when it came to the flying scenes, but in either argument, it really did fit the character and it made it an iconic pose. Now, granted, if you do want to go with the flat sort of open hand design, he technically comes with a symmetrical pair of those hands as well, except it's these hands that I do have a little bit of a problem with, because even though it's got that very iconic kind of, open hand, flat kind of gesture to then again favor some of those positions that he had throughout the 4 films he was in. What the hell, McFarlane? Look at the massive proportion of these hands, because if anything, this is exactly where I do think to myself, okay, McFarlane, it's time to rein it down. There's got to be some way to reach a happy medium, because with recently the neo-gothic Batman Beyond, he came with that really undersized right open hand. And now we got some massive hands to the point where it makes it look like Superman's going through an allergic reaction. Because look at these palms, man. Jesus Christ. Look at these massive palms. God, I'm trying to remember what movie it was. I want to say, Willy Wonka, where she swells up like a blueberry. Kind of reminds me a little bit of that, only with his proper skin tone. So I don't know. I understand what they were trying to do as far as, like I said, that pose, that open hand, narrow pose, or very straightforward planking pose. But god damn it, there must have been a better solution to make sure that these palms don't look as unnatural as they do here. Now, if you don't want to favor any kind of flying poses, he does come with 2 extra pair of asymmetrical hand accessories. This is exactly what you're paying for when it comes to a collector's edition, because frankly, apart from like some gimmicky stuff, I've always loved that the collector's editions have always gone the extra mile as far as the hand accessories. You got your symmetrical, very general, straightforward pairs such as fists, open hands, clenched hands, extending hands, grappling hands in the case of Batman. But then you got some others that kind of favor either specific poses or scenes from a certain property. And as far as Christopher Reeve's Superman, you got this pair right here that I'm going to jump the gun a little bit because this is probably the most unique one. But if anything, it kind of reminds me straightforwardly of the first movie, because you have this pointing hand for the right that, if anything, it's funny because he technically pointed with his left. But if there was another scene that I'm missing right now or I can't think of right now, please let me know in the comments. But the only time that I remember Christopher Reeve's Superman pointing is when he's talking to Lois during the interview. And she's like, oh, you don't want people to know your age. And he kind of like points at her like, you got it. That's kind of what it reminds me of. And then, of course, you have the iconic left hand that is holding the crystal, the kryptonite crystal right there, the green crystal. And even though I do like the inclusion of this and the actual presentable look to it, kind of wish that they would have at least either sculpted the extra piece of translucent green plastic on the inside of the hand as opposed to this solid skin tone section right there that just kind of takes me out of it. Kind of reminds me of those extra pieces underneath his ears that just bother me. So it feels a little cheapy to kind of go out here with extra skin tone paint applications on the inside of the hand. I kind of wish that they would have just cut that out, because as it is right here, it feels a little rushed out of the machine, especially when you got very open and individually sculpted fingered hands over here that are the other asymmetrical pair. And the reason for why I say this towards the end is because you have the left hand, which is kind of like in this extending kind of pose to kind of make it look like it's just reaching out. Maybe he's trying to save someone, etc. So you have that option there. But then you have the right hand that looks pretty similar to the hands that he has on right now. But the only difference is that you'll notice that the 4 fingers are individually sculpted as opposed to the ones that are on his person right now that have the 4 fingers kind of sculpted and gelled together. And so you're wondering, what exactly is the reason for this hand in particular? Well, I have a theory. It's probably a terrible theory. A lot of you don't really like it when I come up with theories. But nevertheless, here goes a tinfoil one. That tinfoil one has got to be is that McFarlane probably threw this hand in so that he can hold a third-party, custom-made glass of beer. Kind of like the one that he was drinking in Superman 3. Which brings us to the last special accessory that comes with this collector's edition, which has to be the alternate evil Superman from Superman 3 head sculpt. And you can see right there that they went with a much broader head with some extra little chiseling and stubble to the chin. You have, of course, a much angrier expression with even a little bit of the smile lines kind of protruding a little bit more out. But of course, the frowny expression, and then the hair a little bit on the looser side as opposed to the coil that he has on by default. And frankly, this could be a bit of a hot take. I don't know about you guys. I feel like this evil Superman head looks more like Christopher Reeve than the default Christopher Reeve one. I don't know what it is, but there's just something about this look right here that, yeah, it's his look from Superman 3. But frankly, as far as likeness on that, 1 through 10 scale, this is more of a 7 as opposed to the 5 or maybe at best 6 that we have going on over here. I don't know. That's just my take. But the only downside is that he does have that much more negative expression to favor his evil Superman look. And that's where I think maybe it pairs well with that gripping hand with the individualized fingers. Because if anything, like I said, my tinfoil hat theory is that this hand is sculpted in a way that looks like it's perfectly fit to be holding like a cup or something cylindrical. And that to me makes me think, yeah, if you have like a 1/10, 1/9 scale or 7-inch scale bottle of beer or a glass of beer or some kind of alcoholic beverage, you could probably recreate that bar scene from Superman 3 along with that head sculpt. And man, as you can see, all this included within this collector's edition bundle along with the appropriately packed in flight stand that needed to be there. Effectively, this is the quintessential release to celebrate one of the most iconic portrayals of Superman ever. If anything, the one that started it all. Christopher Reeve, Superman from 1978, wonderfully directed by Richard Donner and brought to life by, like I said, Christopher Reeve. That every time he graces the screen, you just can't help but smile, despite the somewhat dated effects and the dialogue, etc. Very archetypal stuff for the 70s. Nobody did it like Christopher Reeve. Even when it came down to separating the personas between Superman and Clark Kent, he nailed it. He really did. And he was able to transcend through those decades to the point where a manufacturer or a company like McFarlane Toys practically had no choice but to commemorate him with a proper collector's edition DC Multiverse 7-inch figure. Say what you want about the brand, say what you want about the line. I know a lot of you can't wait for him to lose the license, but I would say that I can feel how they felt the need to bring justice to this version in this $30 bracket. It definitely feels like there wasn't any malice here. Sure, maybe, like I said, some nitpicks could have been a little bit better refined as far as the articulation, or like I said, the little thing on the S symbol. But effectively, I gotta figure here that coming from a Batman fan who really digs Batman way more than he does Superman, and even I can look at this figure and go, yeah, if I was still doing some sort of ranking video for my top 5 figures of 2024 into 2025, regardless of whether they're Batman or not, Christopher Reeve Superman from McFarlane Toys would be in the running. And even with the few nitpicks that I had, such as that little bit on the S symbol, or the fact that around the torso area they did a little bit of that really weird paint wash where you can see a little bit of the warping, or the minor scratch that mine came right out of the box. I don't understand why that happened. Still, even while posing this figure, putting it up in a flight position, filming the B-roll, I still couldn't help but smile at the figure the same way that I do when I first start watching the movie and I see those titles just flash across the screen with John Williams' iconic fanfare playing in the background. And because of that, it manages to fly by the grace of its cape ever so slightly into a very, very low 9 out of 10. So much so that I hardly ever give in to the instinct to want to hunt down a Platinum Edition, but I'll be damned if I don't walk into a Target or a Walmart in the next few weeks and don't walk out with that Platinum Edition Evil Superman should I see it in the aisle, because I really want that, especially with the red eyes, and then of course the much darker aesthetic to the suit, which I gotta be honest, hot take, I don't know what it is, but maybe it's just the color palette that I like. I like that it's the classic Superman, but with the darker tone, it's just much more pleasing to me. So if I ever see that Platinum Edition, yeah, trust me, I'll be picking it up, probably doing some kind of short review with it and kind of comparing the two, but hopefully we'll cross that bridge, or rather fly over that bridge when we get to it. In the meantime though, this is quite honestly one of the most in-demand figures from McFarlane Toys entering into 2025. And if you guys are on the hunt down for it, let me know. Have you had any luck? Did you come across it in store? There's actually been a surprising amount of people finding it in Walmarts and Targets, but only in the much more populated areas. Or are you hunting down for the Platinum Edition specifically, much like how I am? And if you do happen to own either the Platinum or the standard release, are you happy with this portrayal of Christopher Reeve's Superman? Do you think they would have done a little bit better? Should they have refined some things? Or is this really the quintessential pickup for any Christopher Reeve Superman fan? Let me know down in the comment section. While you're down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not. And as always, stay humble. I'll catch you guys later. Take care.